I want to talk today about something that's fundamental to the museum world, to all of us, and that is who gets to speak in the museum, because traditionally museums have been closed environments dominated by experts. And this I can say from a long experience. For the past 25 years, I've been working in institutions around the world, from institutions such as the Science Museum in Amsterdam to the Applied Arts Museum in Frankfurt. I, for a short time, but a very productive time, worked as the Director General of a foundation to promote creativity, learning, and play with children. From 2006, I was Director General of the Palazzo Strozzi, which became a laboratory for new ways of public interpretation. And from 2015, I've been at Brera with a wonderful team, and just recently I've been reconfirmed as the Director General of the Brera. So we have a lot of work still to do in front of us. Now, I want to basically sketch out three basic arguments today. I want to stories are told, what stories and who stories are told. I want to then use specific experiments to illustrate different ways we can tell stories. And then I want to conclude with the work we've been doing here at Brera for the past 4 years, which is the fruit, is the result of 25 years of experimentation, together with different teams of absolutely gifted professionals, because I find that allowing other voices, the first voices you start to invite, are the voices of your own staff, of your own collaborators. Their voices have to be heard as well. So the overall argument is based on a dilemma that I had some time ago in the very top-down way in which museums tell their stories. There are many museum conferences around the world saying, we should be better storytellers, we should tell the stories, but the assumption is always that the people telling the stories are us. And this has the odd effect, curiously, of not changing the way we tell stories, just changing the content of the stories. So what we've seen in recent decades is a great, for instance, concern about telling stories that have been forgotten, telling stories of women who have disappeared from history, of minorities that haven't been included, of people who have been victims of oppression. And museum after museum after museum is created to tell those people's stories. But very strangely, most of the time, those stories are told by the same people who are telling the other stories. So effectively, our museums of victims still sound like our museums of heroes. We just changed the roles around. And I think that we have to go deeper in our work to challenge not just the content of the story, to say, oh, those people don't have their stories told, well, let us tell them, but say, how do we actually open the museum to be a platform for other voices that often are dissonant, can compete with the authoritative voice, but essentially create a new context for the kinds of expert voice that has dominated museums for years. And it's not just a matter, as they say in America sometimes, the argument for museums demography has changed to perhaps have new populations moving in, is they want to see a familiar face in the museum. So in the middle of Baltimore, there have been some absolutely fabulous exhibitions where they have looked for the African presence in Renaissance art in order to give a familiar face to the community. But I think even that doesn't go far enough, because it's not enough just to find familiar faces. It's to hear different voices and recognize the importance of the diversity, not just the sameness to myself. Now, history is a very delicate thing because there are different kinds of histories. We all know the kind of history that consists of a national narrative. Americans are very good with this, that they have a founding myth, the manifest destiny, they arrived on the shores of an apparently empty continent and moved out of the way all the distractions like the native people and moved their way across the country. This is the national narrative, and it's very difficult to challenge. We saw in the discussions around the bombing of Nagasaki the fact that at the end of the day, America was not able to allow its main museum of science and technology to tell the Japanese side of the story of the bombings in Nagasaki. Now, there's another kind of memory that we have, which is collective memory, the things we remember, the things that make us who we are, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are. In Italy, it's actually one of the most remarkable things about coming to Italy as a foreigner is there are no Italians. You go to a restaurant, and the first thing that two Italians, when they meet each other, the first thing that they'll say is, "Where are you from?" "Oh, I'm from Pistoia. I'm from Rome. No, I'm a Napoleon." There's no Italian there. There's just local identities, which are very specific and very rich. They're very deep memories and deep stories. But that's very hard to trap in the context of the national story. And then finally, of course, there's history as we know it. There are documents that say, on this day I was in this place and I did this sort of thing. Now, of course, analytic history is indispensable. It's our way of challenging competing stories, but it isn't sufficient. I once worked with the director, a very brilliant director of the Missouri Historical Museum, Robert Archibald, who told the story of being a student. He was an anthropology student. And he went out and he asked the native people in the southern part of the United States, he went out and he wanted to hear what they said about what happened when the first white people came. And so he met an old man who was sitting in front of his hut, and he said, "Well, what do your stories tell about what did you do when the white people came?" The chap, sat up, thought about it, and said, "Well, when the white people came, we got on our horses and we rode to those mountains over there. We rode into the mountains." And this young director, graduate student, said, "Ha, no, you didn't. You didn't have horses before the white people came." And he said that to the old man. And the old man got up, gets out of his chair, walks back to his house, and comes out with a huge book. Basically, Frank Boas's Anthropology of the American People. Said, if you'd wanted that answer, you could have looked it up. What I'm telling you is what we remember. So you have to think that the way even history is more fluid than we think. And in fact, our role as memory institutions, as institutions of memory, is to respect the richness of our memories. We know from experience. If you ask a brother and a sister about the same thing they experienced when they were 9 years old, they will have different memories of the same event. Who can say which one was true? It's very difficult, and it's very dangerous to start to impose these forms of truth-telling on telling stories and on memories. And basically our job, and this is Robert Archibald's word, is our job is to create the context in which people can create new stories and reach some level of consensus around them. Because the difference between the stories isn't the problem. It's the fact that as people, our museums are places where we can build consensus around the kinds of stories we tell. And different stories, difference, diversity, otherness is fundamental, because without that otherness, we can't build the consensus. And the way we use museums as an expression, not just of our memory, but our civility, is based around how we negotiate those stories. Now, what is a museum? My best working definition of a museum is Nelson Goodman's, who said that an institution is there for the prevention of blindness, because it makes works work. Our museums make works work, and they do this by stimulating inquisitive looking, sharpening our perceptions, raising our visual intelligence, and by doing so, they participate in the making and remaking of our worlds. Now, I come back to that again. It's actually a variation on what Robert Archibald said, and reaching consensus around stories, making and remaking our world. The museum is fundamentally an activist institution, because memory is not a library with a book in which the words never change. Imagine a library where you went in, and every time you took a book off the shelf and opened it, Actually, the words were slightly different than when they were first there. Every time you go back, the words have slightly rearranged themselves, which is how our lives work. Every time we go back to our memory, we reconstruct. One former professor of mine said, we recompute. Memory is not stable, it's not a fixed place. It's our active remaking of our world. Now, what is the heart of the museum experiment? Where do our words come? Where does the voice happen in a museum? Well, the prime place, in my opinion, is in the label. Now, the label, in my opinion, is not a piece of paper with words on it. That's a very limited definition. Labels look like that sometimes. But a label is everything we do as an institution whereby we want someone to create meaning. Somebody is going to make and remake their world around a situation we create. So in fact, if you put a Picasso beside an African mask, you don't have to write down, compare and contrast these things. You just have to put those two things there. That's a label. You want people to make meaning. You want people to see, wow, there's similarities here, there are differences here. So this is what we do in museums. Now, I want to look now very briefly at some experiments we did at Palazzo Strozzi, taking as our challenge the label as the voice of our museums. So basically, this is Palazzo Strozzi was used as an experimental site for labeling, largely because I'm obsessed with labels. Now, why would we want other voices? One of the first questions curators ask is, well, why? We're the experts. We know what to say. Our stories are the right stories. We wouldn't want to lie to people. So why would you invite other voices? Here's an example of a label written by a curator about a very beautiful Cézanne at our first show at Palazzo Strozzi, and it's a very good label. It's got short sentences, it's very clean, it gives you new information, it tells you something about Cézanne. It's a good label. But I also, for that exhibition, asked an 11-year-old girl and a 9-year-old girl to write labels for those that painting. Well, actually, all the Cézannes. And next slide. Now, the 9-year-old and the 11-year-old wrote very different kinds of labels. Well, Cézanne sure does like green. Yes. No curator would write that label. I think this is a breezy day in spring because the sky is gray and people are trying to drive. This is a depressing painting because most of the people are frowning. The 5 bathers seem to be all getting along, except for one of them on the right who seems to be crying. Now these, have no expert truth value, but they are remarkable labels. Why are they remarkable? Because when people read these labels, they didn't just keep going. They went back to the painting. And they took their friend and they said, do you think that boy's crying? He could be just drying his hair. He's hunched over. Is this a sad thing? People stayed with that painting for 10 minutes instead of 10 seconds. So the curators actually no longer were so upset. They said, well, that's what we want. We want people to look at our paintings. So we won a big battle with that set of labels. And that became the first in a series of experiments. We now also at Brera do family and children's labels. We also did labels where we had experts who wrote the text in the middle, but then I gave their text to 6 other experts. The experts read them and I recorded what they said, and they didn't all agree. Some experts said, no, it wasn't like that at all. I was embarrassed then too. It wasn't like that at all. And others said, yes, it was like that, but it was different. Now, what does this do when that becomes a label in a public museum? Is visitors say, well, if the experts can't agree, maybe my opinion can count too. Maybe it's all right that there's no truth here, that experts disagree. So this experiment went further and further. When we did an exhibition on Tang Dynasty Art, and this is for the Asia Society a very important theme, looking at other cultures, curiously in the West, most of the curators of other cultures are still from the home culture, from our basically white Anglo-Saxons, including the curator of our exhibition on Chinese art. But what I did is I took the pictures, all the object pictures, and I went to China several times, and I interviewed Chinese visitors to museums. I said, what do you see when you look at this bodhisattva? beautiful bodhisattva with 1,000 arms. Now, we see a very exotic image, and what's this creature with 1,000 arms? And the Chinese say, oh, it's obvious, it's Guanyin. It's the bodhisattva with 1,000 arms to embrace you. Wow, we don't see that. So we did a whole series of labels with the voices of the Chinese talking about their objects. And these were juxtaposed with the curator's label telling what the provenance was, etc. We also were very lucky. We did, of course, family and children's labels. We had an installation done by Romeo Gili, a very important designer. We didn't put anything under glass cases. This became an exhibition that was extremely accessible. And we had Chinese visitors who came in and they just wept because they said, this is our culture. They felt that they were being represented. As I said, we always do family and children's labels, but we also have, in some cases, we invited poets. One of Italy's most famous children's poet, Roberto Kamini, wrote the labels for our Bronzino exhibition. And he wrote them in beautiful poetry. He wrote, for another exhibition, he wrote the labels in rhyming riddles. Now, the thing about a riddle is that people then read the riddle and they look at the picture and they stay a long time because they want to solve the riddle. What does a good label do? It gets people to look at the art. Labels aren't there to be read. They're there to get you to look at the art. So the riddles kept audiences looking at difficult objects, which were in this case tapestries, for a long time. We also experimented with labels where the two experts actually not only disagreed, but disagreed violently. In this case, we did an exhibition called Money and Beauty, about the birth of the Florentine Renaissance with the investment of the bankers. And one of the label writers, one of the curators, was a male Protestant writer, probably, a very tough writer. And the other curator was a female, feminist, Italian art historian, Catholic. And on the same object, they would be writing two totally different labels. Now, and they were identified. They signed their labels. How often do you go to a museum, and how often do you see the label signed by the person who wrote it? Almost never. Nobody writes labels in a museum. God writes the labels, right? They're just there. That's the truth. And so one thing we started to do was insist on signatures, because everyone who writes a label has their own history. They studied art history in Florence. They studied in America. They learned this. Their thesis advisor was this professor. They all are different. So signatures on labels start to recognize whose voice you're listening to. You're not listening to an abstract voice of truth. You're listening to a real person. This became even more visible when we did an exhibition on the 30s in Italy, which was a very difficult time for Italy because it was a time of fascism. And we realized that unlike Michelangelo's time, where you can't really interview his cleaning lady, because they said he was really very messy, but we can't tell because we couldn't interview his cleaning lady. But in the 30s, you could interview people who grew up in the 30s. And we did. And we created a whole level of labels with photographs of their hands, accompanying the voices that told what it was like to grow up in the 1930s. We also had, more importantly, we put a radio studio in the middle of the exhibition and invited children to interview their grandparents about their experience of growing up, whether it was in the 30s or whether it was in the 40s, the 50s, or 60s. We created, with this one instrument of a radio studio in the exhibition, we created an oral history of childhood in Tuscany. So these are ways of not putting in new content, but inviting new voices. We can also get those voices to go outside the museum. I had storytellers that went out into Florence on a bicycle and using a Japanese tradition called Kamishibai, which of course you will know of. Kamishibai was a storytelling tradition from the 30s in Japan, which is at the heart and the beginning of manga anime. We had actors going around to the schools and telling stories. Now there are Stories are interesting things. Stories are very delicate. And we often think stories have to be linear narratives. One of the worst features of many exhibitions is that they assume that a visitor will read everything and go 1, 2, 3, 4 in a line. You see this in exhibitions that are based on historical narratives. Now, it's a very useful thing to have chronology if you declare it, but I think it's very important to create stories that are narrative, so they have coherence, they add up to something, but they don't have to be linear. And in fact, the prize-winning Canadian writer Alice Munro once said, a story isn't like a road to follow, it's more like a house. You go inside and you discover how the room and corridors relate to each other, and the world outside is altered by looking out the windows. That's what a good exhibition does. I now want to pass to the work that we've been doing for the last 4 years here at Brera with a fabulous team, because all these ideas and all these experiments, it was often said to me, oh, but that's easy, you do temporary exhibitions. Oh, you can do that there. We can't do that in a museum. And I was very frustrated by that. As I said, why not? Why do our museums have to be more boring than our exhibitions? Why do our science museums have to be more exciting than our art museums? Well, you can touch things in a science museum. You say, well, hang on here. You touch with the mind, you don't touch with the hands. So all these issues that I've been struggling with for 30 years almost came to a wonderful focal point here in Milan at the Pinacoteca de Brera, where we had the challenge of transforming the museum and of giving it back to the city in which it belongs. The first thing we did is we developed a mission, and the first part is to put Brera back in the heart of the city. Because part of letting new voices in, you have to give the museum back to the people whose voices are most present, who are the people who live in the city. And then we said we have to put the visitor back at the heart of the Brera experience. And so the first part of this, and I'll go very quickly through this, was the first thing we did is that we reinstalled the entire collection for the first time in 40 years. Now, I'm going to go through very quickly and show you the transformation. See on the left-hand side, the before picture, in this case, of the display of the Caravaggio in a room that was very overlighted, very flat, not very tasty, and it became a very emotional, dramatic installation. You can see this throughout the entire reinstallation. We gave back the focus and drama to the works of art, so you could look at them more closely and with greater emotion. We also started to tell the story of what museums do, because we don't just show pictures. Showing pictures is only a small part of what a museum does. We also conserve paintings. We also store paintings. We study paintings. Museums are an institution, as an institution of memory. We have a lot to do that goes beyond just sticking paintings on the wall. So we have an open restoration laboratory, and that's probably the only one in Italy. We also decided to appropriate our shop as a vehicle for telling the story of the museum, the story of its great directors. In the background of this, you see one of the most revolutionary directors of the museum, Franco Russoli. We created a new cafe in the name of the first woman director in Italy. The first woman to direct a museum in Italy was a director of Brera, a heroic figure who reopened the museum after it had been bombed in the war, Fernanda Victrix. So now the museum, every corner of the museum is interpretive. It tells a story. It has a voice. This is a voice of our own past. So an institution of memory that forgets its own past is not, you can't call an institution of memory. So the first thing we had to do is overcome this social dementia that allowed us to forget who we were. This is the cafe. In the back, we have a beautiful sculpture of this first woman director. Now let me just finish by focusing on labeling and new voices. Here we have a very explicit labeling strategy. In this case, I'm talking about different forms of labels, but specifically the written captions. We have here specific new kinds of labels. We have, of course, the expert's label, the label that it tells you the story of the piece of art, where it comes from, who painted it, when it was painted. This is an important part of our job. We have to give people the basic reference points to see the art. But we also have other labels. Over 15% of the labeling is other. We have labels written by our educational team for families and children that often allow families to tell stories about the paintings that they might not otherwise know, because a family can come in, it's not a family of art historians. So you have to prepare them to show things. Did you see the little rabbit under the chair there? Did you see that little angel in the sky? Did you see those 3 monks going up the stairs? Sometimes things are very small, details are important. But for a child, it can change their life. Because the fundamental mission of a museum is to transform people's lives. Now, that child who sees the rabbit under the chair may not become an art historian. They might become a biologist. That's not the point. The point is the experience in the museum has the potential of setting a person on a path that will go to the end of their life. We also have a very special kind of label that are written by famous authors. Not because they're famous, but because they're writers. Because curators, even the best curators, and even the best educational teams, well, they're curators or they're educators. Writers are writers are writers. They write, they use words in a specific way. So we have labels written by Orhan Pamuk, Ali Smith, Ingrid Rowland, Sarah Dunant, Tiziano Scarpa, Joy Kogawa, Yuko Ogawa. We have the voice of writers writing about paintings in a way that gets you to look at the painting longer. They write differently. There's one label, in fact, that has no painting. It's in the room with Caravaggio. It's a label that's only about light. There's a light shining on the label, and you read it and you say, well, where's the object? It's just about light, because what is Caravaggio except a reinvention of the use of light in painting? And these labels are used. They're large, they're readable, they're accessible, because this labeling strategy also has an implicit strategy of openness, of recognition of other groups, of not people with handicaps, but people with other ways of looking at the world, other ways of interfacing with the world that potentially represent a way of enriching everybody's experience in the museum. For instance, often labels are done for the blind. This is a good thing. We want to give partially sighted and blind people an experience at the museum. But we also, by putting tactile labels, by putting braille labels, by putting olfactory labels in the museum, we also create a richer experience for everybody who comes to the museum. We also include other groups in the museum that are often left behind. Other voices means inviting other people. And so we have programs for new citizens, for patients with Alzheimer's disease and their carers, for people with Parkinson's disease. We're working on ways of supporting the entire community from birth to effectively to the end of life by creating opportunities at the museum where their voices can be heard and appreciated. So the idea is that we have programs also with children's hospitals, with the hospices, with old persons' homes, in order that everybody finds their voice in the museum. In the museum, it's the visitor at the center. So you can move around the museum, and you're not just there to look at things passively, you can become an artist. We have drawing benches where people can sit down and draw, and I can tell you that what they draw is not trivial. These are not scribbles. People, when they see that they're being respected, because the key word here is respect, when they're respected, they will sit down and behave respectfully. They draw seriously. So these are all ways in which including other voices in the museum enriches the museum experience. Of course, this is also supported by instruments, by kits, by suitcases, by books, by a children's guide. This is supported by publications that we create at the museum. It is also supported by an active program of remembering our own past and remembering the past of the country. And that finds its expression most strongly on our website in a section called Brera Stories. But it also finds its place on our website in something I consider remarkable, because it really says that everybody's voice counts. And that's a site called My Brera. And this is a collective portrait of the people who work here. These are the people who work at Brera. Underneath each one of those pictures is a story, is a video account, is a transcription, is a description of where these people come from, where our staff come from, what paintings they prefer, who they are. So this is the first storytelling. If you're serious about other voices, the first people, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, you listen to are your own staff, because this is who the museum is. I want to conclude with an observation about diversity and difference and other voices. This is one of our iconic paintings. It's the Caravaggio. It's a story. It's a biblical story of two people walking along the road, and they meet a stranger, and it's getting to be dark at night. And instead of running away from the stranger or telling him to get out of town or treating the stranger in an uncivil way, they invite him to dinner because they don't want him to get mugged on the road. They invite this person to dinner. And at a time in Europe, at least, where we're facing debates about how to deal with people in need, the strangers we meet on the road, this painting becomes a symbol of this museum's commitment to recognizing that difference is not something to be shunned, is not something to be demonized, is not something to be to drown in the Mediterranean. It's something we have to accept, embrace, and welcome. And this particular painting has a curatorial label, but it has two authors writing about it. One, a secular Catholic, and the other, a Japanese-Canadian devout Catholic. And people will look at this painting and debate which of the two positions are most important for 15 minutes. I see people talking about this painting because it represents a great deal. I think that as museums, we have to remember we are part of our world. We are not just temples of beauty. We are not outside of the world we live in. We are part of the world we live in. And the first question we have to ask is, whose world is that? I mean, we have to say, what matters, whose voices matter? And I think we have to declare that the museum is a fundamental instrument of our civility, and that civility consists in the recognition of difference and the importance of allowing us to make and remake our worlds and to tell different stories and reach some form of consensus around them. These fundamental values, the museum is an expression of our values as a society. It is not edutainment, it is not entertainment, it is not the leisure industry, it is an expression of who we are at our best. That's what a museum is about. And then we have to decide what world we want to live in. And with this, I close with a quote by Ivan Illich, who was a philosopher that became very popular in the 60s and very unpopular. But reading him again, what he wrote in 1973 sounds strikingly relevant, because he was talking about the world we lived in a way that Greta Thun would talk. I believe that a desirable future depends on deliberately choosing a life of action over a life of consumption, rather than maintaining a lifestyle which only allows us to produce and consume, a lifestyle which is merely a way on the road to depletion and pollution of the environment. The future depends on our choice of institutions which support a life of action. Brera is a museum, and our museums are places where we learn to be active citizens and take active responsibility for the worlds we live in and the memories we take care of. Thank you. And I can hear you, and I can hear questions if anybody has questions to ask.
So I'm Kamini Sani from MAP, the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore. And I loved the whole idea of having different kinds of labels from different sources. The only thing is, I was wondering is how practical is it to have 4 or 5 labels for one object? Because here in India, we also have different languages that we need to use to be accessible. So does it cut down then the number of objects that you can have on display? How do you deal with the multiplicity of it?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to repeat the question for the people in the audience here, which is, the question is, how practical is it to have multiple labels for a single object? The first observation is indeed, it is a constraint. But on the other hand, we also have 2 languages. All of our labels are in English and Italian. In Amsterdam, we did labels in 4 languages. It's something you have to take into account, but it should not be a hindrance. The importance is that what you write is something that's worth reading. We keep our word counts very low, so there's only, say, 600 characters. The label writing is very disciplined. But in fact, it is just a constraint that if you accept that strategy, you accept that this is what happens. It does eventually limit the total number of works you could display, but you have to ask yourself, which is more important? Sometimes one object can do the work of 10. We often have the tendency to put too many objects in an exhibition space, and the visitor is merely confused. Sometimes it's better to have fewer objects and more interpretation than the other way around.
Is there another question in the audience for James? Oh, there's one over here, house left.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Laura Williams, Art 1821, Gallery Curator, Advisor. That was a great talk, thank you. I enjoyed it very much. Is it possible that the curation can take over from the objects? Does it get to the point where the labels actually become an object in themselves?
If the label is a good label, it will never be an object in itself. A good label is a good label because it gets you to look at the object. The object can never stop being the focus of our work. And in fact, you can test that. You would be able to see if the label was getting more attention. You would realize that was not a good label. Labels are there to get you to look at objects with new eyes in different ways. So it is very, clearly here there is a process internally also of discussion, of debate, of observation. You have to look at what you're doing also as a prototype. Everything you do is subject to change. And when you're designing these things, you have to make sure that you don't, for instance, make your labels in marble and carve the labels in. Our labels can be changed overnight if there's an error, if there's a comment that needs to be taken into consideration. So you have to treat everything you're doing as a working prototype. And in that way, you can identify issues where there may be a conflict between the label writing and the object. We have not found that, actually. But again, when you're editing the labels, when you're working on the labels, you're looking at labels that get you to look at the object.
Is there another question? Oh, there's one in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Shukla Sawant, and I'm a professor of visual studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. My question is about the fact that there are certain countries, for example, in Italy, where there is a surfeit of publics. So, for example, in Venice, it's literally groaning under the kind of crowds that come in, and you can almost not get into most of the museums because there are these huge, humongous queues outside. Now, there is this role that the museum also plays about, preserving objects, ensuring that they don't get damaged by excess moisture, etc., and physical presence of people inside closed precincts. And I was thinking about the kind of solution that, for example, the Chinese have developed around the Dunhuang site, where they actually have a very regulated public coming in, and they've created a whole network of institutions around the main site, dispersing the public in such a way that it is still given, various forms of access to knowledge, but the main site is also preserved so that the works, in fact, don't get damaged by excess tourist kind of presence.
Okay, that's a difficult question because it's not quite a question. It's a legitimate observation because it's linked to the whole notion of too many visitors or the ideal number of visitors in a space. What I can say is that labeling, depending on the site, because there are archaeological sites, there are different kinds of museums, but certainly speaking of an art museum, what we also find that the labeling physically allows you to create distance in two ways. On the one hand, if they're written in large text and readable, people will stand back because you try to create a label that's readable at the ideal viewing distance of the painting, which is often several meters away from it. So as long as the label is written in large print, people will stand away from the object, so thereby they don't risk it. The second is that the support that holds the label serves also as a way of keeping visitors from getting too close. So it serves a double purpose in keeping people away from the object. The problem with very small labels beside paintings in small type is people crowd around them and in fact risk the painting more. But this is true of art galleries. It's not necessarily true of archaeological sites or house museums. So I'm very aware that there are different typologies that require different solutions.
There's another question in the sixth row.
Hello, I'm from Taiwan. I'm the director of National Museum of History. I do agree with what you said about labeling is important. We encourage our staff to increase their ability of writing new explanation card. And my question is that, do you agree with that the labeling thing, the labeling job, is very much to do with the so-called labeling is a pointer, point or guide our audience to somewhere. This is the first explanation on labeling. The second explanation on labeling is that, do you agree with labeling is some kind of intertextuality, which means that the two contexts dialogue each other. Therefore, we have more dialogue on one object or on a painting.
Okay, whether a label is a pointer and if a label is also intertextual, I would say, answering the second question first, it is a form of intertextuality, it's clear, because it is our voice. It's as if we were talking to a visitor, but we can't be there. By definition, it's intertextual, it's creating a space of dialogue. The first question, whether it's a pointer, is very interesting because, in a sense, I am very cautious about labels that point too much because, of course, there might be other things to look at. I think it's more about opening eyes because you don't see what you don't know sometimes. I gave the example of the Bodhisattva. You may see a thousand-armed figure, but you would see far more if you understood that it was representing compassion. So I think labels also help you to understand how to go beyond the immediate. We have here, for instance, sometimes Chinese visitors, in fact I did this experiment at the Uffizi in Florence, who would look at a Madonna and Child, which is a fundamental image in Christian iconography, but if you're not aware of that iconography, the question comes up, well, who's the nanny? And in a way, of course, what a person sees is a woman and a baby, and that's a natural question. But you could see far more in a painting if you understood what that was representing. So labels do more than point. Labels give you a way of seeing more in a painting, and I think a good label does exactly that.
Great. So, we have one last question from the back.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. I want to know your view about... sorry? Yeah, my name is Rubina Karode, and I am the Chief Curator and Director of the Kiran Naidu Museum of Art in Delhi. And I know the obvious meaning of inclusive, and working with the museum for the last 10 years, I have been listening this term a lot, trying to understand it as well. I would like to hear from Hugh what comes to your mind as an example of a good museum or a museum that is inclusive. What all characters or what all considerations would you put under this word inclusivity or inclusive as a term that you would use for a museum? When you say this museum is inclusive.
It's a very interesting question. What would you define as an inclusive museum? I think that the words inclusion, accessibility overlap a great deal. And I think what you want to see in an inclusive museum is the elimination of invisible barriers to participation, which is to say that physical barriers you can eliminate. It's the invisible barriers, which are barriers of class, of presentation, the language you use in your labeling, etc. So an inclusive museum, I think, is one where you start with inclusion by respect and recognition. The approach of signing labels, for instance, is part of that, where you declare who you are, not trying to be something you aren't, because if being inclusive means somehow everybody being the same or arriving at a single neutral position, I think that's a mistake. I think the key to inclusion is to recognize diversity. And to recognize diversity, you have to express that both physically and in words, the way in which you recognize that there are people that are not the same. I think that we are a very inclusive museum, but again, we're in the middle of the city of Milan. We're in a certain economic zone. It is clear, if you came to the museum, that there are certain groups that do not come yet to the museum. And so I think that when you do that sort of observation, you have to go back to your team and say, how can we make the museum more welcoming for groups that are not participating, but also taking into account the fact that some people may never want to come to a museum, just like I don't ever want to go to a football game. So it is also legitimate to not want to go to a museum, but you have to make sure that there's nothing that stops me from going to a football game. So one has to be careful about being too, I think in the museum field, sometimes we believe a museum is good for everybody, and everybody should take their museum every morning, when they get up and with their breakfast. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Museum going is a choice, and it should be a free choice. There just shouldn't be any obstacles to my choosing it.
Great. So I'm passing this to Boon Hui.
Okay, and finally, thank you, James and Team Brera and Vival for joining us today, all the way from Milan, and navigating all, as you can see, the very complex technical challenges of making a live presentation, and for your inspiring words and your provocative ideas. We certainly hope the next time you will actually physically be able to join us at the next summit. Have a good day, and once again, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. Ladies and gentlemen, James Bradburne.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah. And if you Google James Bradburne, he has a great website where there's a lot of text on it, and it's worth taking a look.